What's up, guys? Welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about cannabis, mota, Mary Jane, devil's lettuce, and we're going to jump right into it with some history on Sae'Von's experience with the flower.
Yes. That gas, as the Migos would like to say. So cannabis is one of those funny things, man, because my whole journey with it, growing up in high school, growing up in general, my dad was real big on, go to school, get an education, wear a condom, don't go to jail, and
The absolutes.
the absolutes, the tenets of life. But basically, it created this environment or this mindset for myself where, obviously that puts some good principles in you. But through my pursuit of what I thought was applying myself, be it in school or in football or whatever it was, I had a very negative outlook on people who did things I didn't do. So whether it be drinking, smoking, both of which everybody, it seemed like, on my football team did, let alone, half or more of the school I went to. And I just had a really negative association with those activities. I thought anybody that smoked weed was an idiot. People who drank were stupid, and that it was all pointless. I was, in a lot of ways, very, very rigid, very judgmental in my framework in my younger years. And so I wound up going to UGA and coming back. I think it was from Christmas break or Thanksgiving break. But anyhow, I'm on 316. I'm close to Athens, close to the exit, really. It may have been the loop, not even 316. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, I wind up flipping my Jeep. I flip my Jeep, and then I get out and shit. I'm freaking out. I'm hysterical. Oh, my fuck. My daddy's going to be so mad. Right. But what that did for me was drive home the point. And also, too, for context, my sister, we lost her to a car accident. So at this moment, I'm like, fuck. I could be dead right now. And if I died right now, how would I view how I have lived my life? And so I reflected and I was thinking, I was like, damn, I gotta do some more things. I gotta try some more shit. And so subsequently, don't know if it was immediately the next week or the week after, some guys I'd gotten to know over the first few months of UGA were on my hall. I trusted a great deal. They used to have this loud pack movement every night where they would, go to the whip, be loud pack gang, and they would go to the tracks and they would smoke. And so I asked if I could partake in this ceremony, and they obliged me. And I hit the blunt for the first time, and I was like, I can't breathe. I thought I was having an asthma attack, all this shit. I was like, I'm gonna be the first nigga to die from smoking a blunt. And they were like, bro, just relax, hit it again, and calm down. And so I did, and they were right. And that is how my journey with the flower began. Now, I've had some different forays. Boy, can I speak English today? Some different forays with the flower, and some good times, some less good times. But I even worked with a CBD startup for a little while. And a couple years ago, my mother, and she's dealt with different ailments over the past, she was trying different things. She got a medicinal card, which is a thing in Georgia, but then the doctors don't really tell you how to actually get any flower. It's more like, hey, get this card. If you get pulled over, it should get you out of trouble. But I was like, look, Mom, I can get you some flower. Just see how it works. And it was a radical improvement versus the opioids and the steroids that she had been on for literally decades, no exaggeration. And so anyhow, I've seen the flower from damn near every angle anybody can see it from, literally damn near every angle. So I'm excited about this conversation, man. I don't know where it's gonna go, but I'm here for it.
Yeah, I have no idea either. My relationship with pot is an anxious one. My relationship with pot is sometimes been a fun one. It's not something that I partake in frequently. It's not something that I could even say that I've ever abused. Alcohol, different story. A lot of other scenarios, different story, but pot, no, it's actually interesting. The conversation around pot came up in my mind when I was going back and forth with some people on Twitter, and something got brought up to my attention, and that was long-term effects that can be seen that are more congruent to the short-term memory loss. But what is the relationship between habitual marijuana smoking, right? Not ingestion through edibles or any other way that you would ingest, but through smoking. What are the long-term effects of that on brain health? And for a long time, and I think for most people, it's preached at you. It's talked about pot being, of the ground, and it being something that can't have any negative effects on you. And I'm not saying that I necessarily know anyone that it's having overwhelming, ravaging effects on their life in a negative sense. However, I am curious about the correlation between short-term memory loss for habitual smokers, and how that is related to long-term brain function, cognitive function over a lifetime. But I'm also interested in maybe the relationship between marijuana and anxiety, even though marijuana sometimes is used to help with anxiety. How many individuals are actually more anxious because of it? And I'm no scientist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a doctor of any sort. But I do find it interesting because I've seen the relationship with marijuana differing drastically based on who's ingesting, based on who's using, based on who is partaking in festivities. I've got a close homie that was dependent on marijuana, amongst other things, but wouldn't go to sleep without smoking.
I can get to that point for people.
To me, I think that that's a problem. That's like, hey, you can't live without caffeine.
It's dependency.
You can't go to social functions without a drink. So I want to kind of dive into that, what your experience has been there. What do you primarily, or have you primarily used it for? For me, it's always been more of an escapism, and I think of it potentially as a substitute because I don't have chronic ailments. I think of it as a substitute for pot or for alcohol or other substances there that maybe have overwhelming empirical evidence to back that they're not in the slightest good for you. But yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very comprehensive. I love it. So to begin with, I'll acknowledge what I began using it for, or how I saw it affect me, how some of my patterns changed over time with it, as well as get into some of the different health implications of it and societal implications. So when I began smoking, as I said in that intro, it was really because I recognized that there was a lot of experiences I had yet to have. And after that kind of, life before your eyes thing, I felt it prudent to go ahead, dip my toes in, because in my family, there was a history genetically of alcoholism. I just say genetically because that's a trait that you can pass down, and it's hit different people on a similar tree that they've all dealt with alcoholism, or several people. And so that made me always weary of even really touching alcohol, because I knew it was in my blood, the propensity to develop alcoholism.
Do you still have the aversion with alcohol?
That's not the reason, but it's mainly health reasons. Like I have seen damn near zero studies of alcohol ever being helpful for anything. If we're not talking about wine and people talking about how it can help you cardiovascular state,
but I mean,
in terms of
drinking,
liquor,
drinking, we're more so talking about spirits. We're not talking about a glass of red wine that's been aged for how many years? Like
organic vineyards, all this other stuff where it's like, cool, the Italians, these other people, yes, a glass a day, they've seen it have effects similar to that of dark chocolates and whatnot. But it's more so because I just know through and through, alcohol has zero beneficial value health-wise, from what I've come across, what I've seen, and I don't really like the taste, and it's expensive. It's just, and I had far greater, easier access to flower, and I'd had positive experiences with it. So I'm like, I don't need to pivot for the sake of pivoting. I don't hold drinking against anybody. There are certain drinks that I enjoy, like margaritas. Some may say that's a woman's drink, fine by me, but I like what I like. Yeah. So what I recognized in terms of the impact was, it made me, it softened me in a good way, not in like the impotence way, but in the it made me
No ED. We
no
have talked
ED.
about that before. Count your chemicals,
Which,
not your carbs.
funny enough, it has been shown that even though flower can help with ED, if people are overly dependent, and I think from what I've seen, it has more to do with the respiratory inhalation of it. That actually can lead to ED with certain people because they become dependent on the flower for sexual performance in a similar effect as Viagra. And funny story, maybe this is TMI, the first time I smoked, I got a crazy erection, like immediately. It lasted for hours, and like people looking at me weird, and I was just like gyrating, and I was like, yo, this shit is crazy, just like activating my root chakra or something. But what I found it to be useful for is it took the edge off. In a similar way that some people drink, for years I had a temper issue, right? And a lot of people who know me now may probably never see that side, but I could just go from 0 to 1 and fucking throttle you in seconds. And that's actually why I started playing football. And so I still had a bit of that edge that I carried with me where I was just a little bit uptight at all times.
To really pop at any moment.
Yeah, or I would just be unnecessarily rough with my demeanor when I didn't need to be. And I recognized, or I found that with the flower, it just eased me. It made me more lighthearted. It made me more easygoing in a way that took zero effort. And once I was in that state, only then could I appreciate how rough or sharp or militant, as my mother used to say, my energy could be prior. I was never like a mean person, but I could be very, short with people, very pointed, whatever. So that was one of the differences that I noticed. And then, even though it began as something where I'm smoking once, twice a week, maybe.
Can I interrupt you for a second? When you say that it made you a little bit more soft, and we're not talking about ED here. About how long from when you started smoking?
Did I notice that change?
Like how long did that take? A couple months, couple weeks?
Immediately. Immediately.
Like while you were high or post calm down?
Literally, once it kicks in, and it's not a feeling of being out of control. Now, granted, you can definitely smoke too much, and I think this is also a distinction to make that, let me finish, let's go down this route further. That's the thing about something like flowers, it kicks in very quickly, and it can take a while to build up a tolerance, or it usually takes a much different use pattern for the effects to change. Now, granted, that also has a lot to do with the type of flower you smoke, and just like people respond differently to whiskey than they might to vodka. The flower I was getting, the first strain I ever smoked was Kim Dong 13. And one of my homeboys, he put me on game, but he had some real quality stuff. And it also matters greatly the quality of what you're smoking, because, for instance, if somebody, or using in general, doesn't have to be smoking, but just using, if somebody is to use a lower quality, just like if you drink really cheap liquor, it can almost be guaranteed to give you a mean hangover versus something that's more quality that, as long as you're hydrated, you'll be perfectly fine. Similar thing with flower. If you're using low grade, Reggie or bunk, as they say, it can have more negative, overtly negative physiological, psychological impact. And the thing to keep in mind as well with the flower is that the flower we see today, it's like mutant in comparison to the, Sinsemilla of decades before. So all the stuff in Narcos that they were selling, that was Sinsemilla, and it was flower, but it was far, far less potent because it was still in a more natural form. Whereas today, people are sitting in labs being paid millions and millions of dollars to literally make the strongest shit possible. And that, in my opinion, is not really optimal.
When you say the strongest shit, you're talking about the highest THC?
Yes.
Like density-wise?
Just so yeah, you could say that, but basically if you were to measure it by micromole, it has a higher concentration of active THC or any active cannabinoid, but typically when you're looking at flower, especially these days, because the CBG, the CBNs are still not really popular yet, you have primarily THC flower, which is what most people think of when they think of weed, and then you have CBD, and CBD is marijuana. It is the same exact fucking plant. The only difference is the CBD variants, they are genetically bred to remove all of the THC basically and get it below that 0.03 delta 9 THC requirement, which is what the hemp law passed. And it's designed to crank the concentration of CBD. But when most people think about gas or smoking weed, Wiz Khalifa, he ain't looking for CBD. They are looking for strong, heavy THC dominant strains. And what I found in the past, and a lot of people I interacted with, they began to associate good flower with the flower that is the absolute strongest. But I think from a medicinal standpoint, that's very flawed in the approach. Because what people should be doing, just like with any solution that somebody is seeking for their health, their well-being, their body, whatever, you need to look for what is going to give you the results you're looking for. So you have certain flowers that are really good for creativity. You have certain flower.
Does that fall on strain type? Like the split?
So
it's indica and sativa?
It's more about
hybrids?
the cohort effect that takes place with the different cannabinoids, the different flavonoids, the different terpenoids in the flower, and the strain is going to have a lineage of carrying a certain dominance of those flowers versus others. So something like a lemon haze, right? The reason they throw that name in there, typically you ever hear any flavor or scent, is because it has a certain ratio of those different properties, those molecules, that maybe it's a lemon-based terpenoid, which typically is what gives the flavor or the aroma, whereas the cannabinoids are what are usually going to have the physiological or the psychological, psychoactive properties contained within it. That's why certain strains can be more likely to trigger creativity, and some strains are more likely in some people to trigger anxiety, perhaps. But it still comes down to somebody really knowing what they can and what they can't handle. And we, as a whole, live in a culture that's very overindulgent. So sometimes, whether
everyone likes
pressure,
to binge.
You know what I'm saying? So it's like, and I found myself in this period for a while where instead of where it went from where I may have been smoking once or twice a week, I was now smoking once or twice a day. And at that point, it becomes that ritual that I found myself in of kicking it with my homies, and, we roll up a blunt. So guess what? We finishing the blunt. Yeah. Where maybe I should have been good after one or two hits. I think it's similar with alcohol, where some people are just like, shots, shots, shots. And it's like, after the first shot, you probably would have been good and had like a great evening. It did what you wanted it to do. It's not fucking punishing your liver.
Yeah, you could sit on a couple beers, a couple drinks, and a couple shots and be fine and coast.
Good.
You can coast till 5 o'clock in the morning and be fine and not wake up the next day.
You could drive home safely.
Yeah.
But it's all about the way in which it's used. And so to the point of what you kind of mentioned earlier about this idea that because it's from the ground, it's good for you. Well, so is cocaine, in its purest form with the coca leaf.
I mean, poppy also grows in the ground too.
You see what I'm saying? But nobody's running out to do opium too much. Once again, it's about the ratio. Narcotics.
Salvia grows in the ground too.
You see what I'm saying? So I think we must be careful about that, because
I think it's a broad stroke that I think that
it's a justification.
People that are pro pot throw that out there like everything that grows in the ground is great.
Yeah.
I don't know about that. I want to dive in a little anecdotally though. What change did you see in your life productivity-wise in how you handled conflict and how you interacted with your romantic partner when you went from once or twice a week to once or twice a day?
I'd say that when you're too high, when you're too intoxicated, when you're too anything, it can skew your perception of things. So it's no secret that for a lot of people, if they get too high, your productivity can go out the window, because there's so much, and I can't claim to know all the exact precise science, but basically the compounds that are in that substance can begin to override certain functions that you would naturally have. So for instance, your vestibular capacity, right? So that's balance and everything. You get too high, it can start to affect that negatively, where now, you might feel a little dizzy, or you might start stumbling if you try to stand up because you're too high. And for me, I think it played out in more so of, it became very difficult to notice how much time had passed. And so sometimes that can be very beneficial, that can be in your favor, other times it's not. Because if you have a deadline and it feels like 30 minutes went by, but for you, it's been 2 hours, or vice versa, it can just begin to, if you skew things. And so I would say there was never anything drastic. But I will say this. If I went, let's say, out to Athens, right? And I'm visiting with some of my people and I partake in the flower, it's far more likely that on my drive back, I'm going to start falling asleep. So it's not that when I'm driving, the road is bending and I've never been drunk and tried to drive, so I can't equate what that's like. But, we see the documentaries and the videos and school and shit. But if I'm more prone to falling asleep, that's still very dangerous on the road. And I know some people who literally won't drive at all if they're high because they're so high that they don't even feel comfortable driving. Now, I've gotten so many reps in that's like, no, I can drive high.
Technically still a DUI, drugs.
Technically.
I mean, but you can also get a DUI less safe for less than 0.08 of alcohol too. All you have to do is admit that you've smoked within a certain amount of time since you got in the car, and there you go. But I'm not even. I think that the sleeping thing is a very important thing to note, though, because the same thing happens with people that work themselves to death.
Yeah.
Like, if I'm working round the clock, I'm just as dangerous falling asleep completely sober, but falling asleep at the wheel behind a car that weighs 6,000 pounds as you are.
Yeah, so I just think that, and then to your point about the anxiety, for some people, if you pass the threshold of what you can control, you then are now at the behest of how this substance is going to interact with you, because there's a really good expression that a metaphysical teacher, I call him a mentor because even though I don't know the man personally, I've learned so much from him over the years. His name is Sae'Von Bomar. He runs a site called Secret Energy. But he made this point one time that dominant frequencies don't negotiate. And that's why we see that some people, their entire energy, their entire being changes under certain situations, certain circumstances, whether it be alcohol, whether it be cocaine, whether it be Molly, or whether it be cannabis. And for some people, they'll get to the point where they've taken so much of any of these substances in, and it doesn't have to be a lot. It just has to be more than they can handle.
Yeah.
Because it metabolizes differently with everybody, that now they're at the behest of this dominant frequency. And it can bring up these feelings of anxiety. It can bring up all sorts of things. I noticed a few months ago, because this is another thing I'll say, and I mentioned this with homeboy that I met up with a couple weeks back who hit you up and was like, yo, I met Sae'Von. And I was sharing with him because he was saying how he doesn't like to engage in any flower during the daytime. But I mentioned to him that I had this realization, this like aha moment sometime earlier this year, that the expression of even getting high, let's think about that just very visually, physically. If we're at sea level, you can get low and you can raise up, you can get high. And so if you're at sea level, or if worse, you're sub-sea level, you may want to get high to raise you out of the depths. But what if you're already high, naturally? Well, what I found is that the flower, because that's the most common, drug I've ever engaged in, actually pulls me down.
So if you're naturally higher, it's going to pull you in the opposite direction.
And I think that some people lose touch of when that begins to be the case.
Kind of like people seem to lose touch when they've had 17 drinks too many. And next thing you know, they're sleeping on the ground.
Or they're forcing themselves on women.
Yes, that's also a very important point to make.
Just because, once again, the dominant frequencies don't negotiate. And I think that something that also is not brought into the conversation that often, because it lacks the same reproducibility and rigor in which someone can study a lot of these very plain molecular phenomena, is that when we engage in these different substances, you open up different portals. And this is just from my own research and what I've looked into, my own experiences. When people think about things like entities or demons or spirits or angels, these are all energies. Just like inspiration is an energy, focus is an energy. And so when people engage in different substances, whether it be cannabis, whether it be alcohol, whether it be shrooms, Percocets, whatever, you potentially, once in my opinion, you cross that threshold, you open yourself up to it. Even before you cross the threshold, you're allowing the energy of that that substance into you. I met this guy, I knew this guy once. He said he was a shaman, right? And we had this conversation. He was telling me about like goat milk and everything because I went to get some groceries and we just started chopping it up. He was like, yeah, man, I'm looking to infuse the spirit of cannabis with this other thing that I'm making. And I never thought about that, the spirit of cannabis. But everything has an energy to it. And depending on how you open yourself up, you can basically, what I'm getting at, you can become possessed by the energies in these substances. So when we talk about different strains of flower, where the flower came from, if it was grown with love and respect, or were people growing it, tumbling it to get all the THC off of it, spraying it down with chemicals to hype the smell, then selling it to you, do you really know what you're buying? Because most people don't really realize that at this point in the game, if you avoid things like genetically modified foods, guess what? Most cannabis that is sold today is genetically altered or modified in some way, shape, or form. Because Big Pharma is in that industry. And so we must keep in mind that a lot of these people in these companies, their end goal is to sedate. It's not to help you. Because a lot of times people can get the greatest effect from these substances without any of the psychoactive properties of it or any of the intoxicating aspects of it. You can get the benefit that you want or that you seek, like my mother gained from the flower without the high, without the intoxication of it. And I think once again, a lot of the proponents, proponents who are unrealistic and extremist about it, maximalist about it, don't want to acknowledge the downfalls, the downsides of these substances. And there are many, even, and I'll say this last point, let you jump in, I've seen studies that show that people who have a tendency for extreme behaviors, so people who might be in the borderline personality, category, or they might be manic depressive or anything else, that substances like marijuana can worsen their condition because it pushes them once again to another extreme instead of balancing them. So it's all about discretion and really understanding what is it you're trying to get out of the flower. And so I'll go through many periods. I'm in one right now where I won't touch flower at all. And really any substances that I know can have that sort of effect, but specifically flower, because I'd recognized too a few months ago, whenever I would have any flower, I would feel this uncomfortability in my body. And at first I tried to write it off, but then it happened again. And it happened even when I didn't smoke that much. And so I was like, okay, well, maybe just based on how my own genetics have activated over the last few years and the epigenetic changes and this, that, and the third, my spiritual progression, flower I'm at a different stage in my journey where the flower does not necessarily help me in the same way that it did at one point. So I must now audit more deeply and profoundly why I use it at all. And so is this my body telling me that we're actually rejecting the flower now? And so that's why you feel uncomfortable, because we're trying to tell you that you don't need to be smoking it.
I mean, we don't listen to our bodies at all.
Till it screams at you.
Yeah, I mean, we really go. And there's just one more thing that I kind of want to leave us on because we're about at that mark. But, you're talking about energies. I think it's important to note also that there's been bloodshed oftentimes to get that pot in front of you. There's many people that don't grow their own. Actually, the majority of everyone does not grow their own. Mm-hmm. It's strenuous. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of know-how. It takes a lot of understanding. It takes a lot of trial and error. Mm-hmm. Most of the time, that pot that's in front of you, like anything, has not necessarily, and you cannot prove that it's been ethically sourced. So keep that in mind. If you do hop on the train where you truly in your spirit believe that things carry with them energy, because you have no way to audit unless you saw it grown in front of you and cut off the stem where it came from.
Wow, thank you for making that point. It's very real because, and this is just from my own experiences and people I've known, most people who move the greatest amounts of flower, if we're not talking about people who run dispensaries, but a lot of times they're the same people, they sell everything. So cocaine, Percocets, opioids, all sorts of things. and they just happen to also sell flower. So usually flower in and of itself is not the most violent, but that's the issue about legalization. You know, when you keep something in a black market, people are going to go through black market tendencies to acquire it, to maintain their market dominance, and so on. So, you know, I'm of the mindset we should legalize all this shit. Let the chips fall where they may. Let people study it. You know,
that's a conversation for another day. Our cameras have cut off. We're gonna have to go into the legalization of all drugs down the road. But appreciate y'all coming today, and hope you found this interesting, and maybe it changed your perspective on something to do with marijuana. Maybe it didn't. Maybe you want to go smoke. I don't know. Not responsible for anything that you're doing, so you do what you want to do. Thank y'all for coming.
Peace. Peace.